Good evening. My name is Caroline Fenner. I am a mother and a teacher, and I'm a member of Mothers Out Front Dutchess County. Welcome to tonight's presentation, Trash the Incinerator, Clean Air for Dutchess County. Before we get started, there are a couple of housekeeping items that we want to share. We ask that all attendees remain muted unless you're called on to speak by the facilitator. Please use the chat box to introduce yourself. You can share your name, your town or neighborhood, your preferred pronouns, and maybe a word or two that describes what brings you to this event. I'm going to turn it over to Johanna Fallert, who's going to give us a general introduction and to the topic, and then also tell us about Mothers Out Front.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this 20-minute presentation, followed by a question and answer session to learn why the Dutchess County Incinerator is a hazard to people, the planet, and our pocketbooks. I'm Johanna Fallert. I live in the town of Poughkeepsie, and I'm a member of Mothers Out Front Dutchess County. I've been an environmental activist since 2016, when I first learned about the Cricket Valley fracked gas energy power plant in Dover Plains on our county's eastern border. Ever since, I've paid close attention to air pollution, the invisible threat to our health and our environment. Tonight's presentation will describe sustainable alternatives to burning our trash and will suggest actions you can take to urge legislators to do the research and implement alternatives that will bring us to a future without incineration. We would like to start out with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional land of the Lenape people. We pay respect to both past and present Indigenous inhabitants as we seek to live in peace and learn from First Nations people who have stewarded this land throughout generations in sustainable and regenerative ways. Tonight's presentation is from Mothers Out Front Dutchess County, the local chapter of the national organization that's powered by moms and grandmoms, but includes all people who advocate for a livable climate for today's children and for future generations. So without further ado, let me present my friend and Mothers Out Front member, Sandy Stratton Gonzalez. Take it away, Sandy.
Good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I am a Mothers Out Front Dutchess County member and a longtime environmental activist, and I'm here to share the research that Johanna and I and Caroline have done about the Dutchess County Incinerator. So I was initially astonished to learn that that's how we deal with garbage here. We burn our garbage. And certainly incineration is not a friend to our environment, to our health, and we know there are better ways to handle our waste. Next slide, please. The Dutchess County Incinerator is the largest polluter, the largest industrial polluter in the county, and this is a county where 61% of our residents are at a high risk for air pollution. So that includes folks with asthma, COPD, heart disease, the very young, and the very older members of our population. And something to know about asthma is that Poughkeepsie has been ranked the 6th most challenging place to live in the United States for people with asthma. So certainly that is not 100% due to the incinerator, but you will find that the incinerator plays a major role. Decisions are going to be made soon about where we go with our garbage. The incinerator is 35 years old. That is not young. That is beyond the age of most similar industrial plants that burn trash. And we know that burning trash is the most expensive and most polluting way to manage waste or to make energy. Next slide, please. Incinerators are outmoded and outdated. Only 10% of US trash is burned. The rest is recycled, composted, or landfilled. And I will make the point that we are not here to promote landfilling as a solution. We have some other more elegant and sustainable ideas. No new commercial scale incinerators have been built since 1995, and the total number of incinerators operating in our country has crashed from 187 in 1991 to only 65 today. Next slide, please. You may know that the incinerator is located in the town of Poughkeepsie at 96 Sand Dock Road, District 5, Ward 5. It burns 450 tons of municipal solid waste every day, 151,000 every year. And of what is burned, 53,000 tons, or nearly a third of the total mass, more than a third of the total mass, it becomes ash. It is a highly toxic substance, and it is landfilled. So it is not true, of course, that incineration prevents landfilling. It changes what we do landfilled. Municipal solid waste includes any discarded materials, and it can include solid liquid or containerized gaseous material. As you can imagine, the ash is toxic to landfill, and the toxins leach into the soil and groundwater. It's not landfilled here in our state, it's landfilled in Pennsylvania. The landfills that exist in New York State have, to my knowledge, refused to take our ash. Next slide, please. So this chart is instructive. All of the red bars represent materials that we burn. And you'll notice that the first three materials, food and yard waste, paper, and wood, constitute 57% of what we're burning. So that represents 57% that is organic materials. You might see over on the right, we're burning 14% of what we burn are plastics, and we all know that the plastics recycling, the idea and reality of recycling has been a disaster. We are burning glass, we are burning metal, right? So some of this is very low-hanging fruit. Pulling the metal out of the waste stream prior to incineration is certainly a win for everybody and is something that can be monetized. Next slide. Our incinerator. It's one of the dirty dozen in the United States for two emissions, mercury and carbon monoxide. And this is a 2019 Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School study. And both of these are problematic. It's also problematic that other pollutants include nitrogen dioxide. We're going to talk about that again because that's an asthma trigger. The EPA measures the 6 criteria pollutants and also measures hazardous air pollutants, and there are 188 of those, and the list is very likely to be expanded. Okay, our next slide shows the 2020 emissions. These are the latest data available to us, and this is what we have. So climate warming pollutant, carbon dioxide, 106,000 tons a year, and that's roughly equivalent to emissions annually from 22,000 gas-powered cars. Nitrogen oxides, 163 tons. This is an asthma trigger, and again, Poughkeepsie is sadly an asthma capital. Carbon monoxide, 77 tons. VOCs, so whenever you burn a carpet, most children's pajamas, draperies, anything that has been treated with a fire retardant, these are volatile organic compounds. They are awful toxins, shouldn't be burned. And then I want to go down to mercury. 13 pounds may not sound like a lot, but a teaspoon of mercury can compromise all of the fish in a very large lake. And of course, we are surrounded by water. Let's go to the next slide. All right, mercury. The incinerator is close to the Hudson River, to the creeks, to the streams. Waste incineration, the mercury becomes airborne. It settles in the water bodies. It is eaten, it settles on the bottom. It is eaten along with the vegetative growth by little fish, who are eaten by bigger fish, who are eaten by bigger fish, which we catch and put on our plates and we eat. Eating fish is the most common way people are exposed to mercury, and it's a neurotoxin. Women who are pregnant and other risk groups are advised to refrain from eating any fish high in mercury. We will share a PDF of this presentation that will have all of these links. One of my favorite sites, it's not a happy site, but the New York State Fish Advisories is a site where every body of water in the state of New York is listed by county. And then it's a chart with every single fish that can be found in that body of water. And then it's parsed out by infants, children, teens, adult women, adult men, older adults, etc., how much of that fish it is okay for you to eat. And it's a sad statement that kind of information has to be published by our state. Next slide. So particulate matter is another grave concern. Particulate matter 2.5 means it is less than 2.5. I don't know what the measurement is, if it's a millimeter, but it's 1/30th the diameter of human hair. It cannot be seen, felt, smelled, or sadly filtered out by our nose or our lungs. So it does hit our bloodstreams. It increases lung cancer, causes heart attacks and strokes, is linked to low birth weights in newborns, and again, triggers asthma attacks. The air, of course, doesn't stay right here. It does travel. We know that from our experience with the Canadian wildfires last summer. And you should know that there's an even larger incinerator in Peekskill, and that our friends in Westchester County are similarly fighting to find sustainable solutions. They're actually a little further along on the path to sustainability, and have an RFP out to craft a study of alternatives. Next slide. So in January, the EPA proposed stricter rules. They are expected to go into effect in November 2024. These new rules would be helpful to the 4 million people living within 3 miles of large incinerators, and to many of the rest of us. But they don't get rid of the health risks. Next slide. And sadly, they don't apply to us. So our incinerator burns those 450 tons a day, and it has 2 burners, so that it's about 225 tons per burner. The total must be 500 tons in order for the EPA regulations for large incinerators to be applied. So they don't apply to us, which is very sad. We're considered a small municipal waste combustor facility. The regulations that cover our class of facilities were last updated in 2003, even though by law they should be updated every 5 years. And that is an infrared photograph of an actual incinerator's emissions. Next slide. And the county will talk about the safety measures and so on and so forth, but we're missing one, and we're missing something called a selective non-catalytic reduction system, SNCR, SNCR. And its job is to filter nitrogen oxide. Nitrogen oxide triggers asthma attacks, and the incinerator is the largest industrial source of nitrogen oxide. There are other controls at the facility, but they're clearly not enough because we have so many emissions, as we've already seen. Including bag filters, which are thousands of vacuum cleaner type bags collecting particulate matter, the fly ash, which is the most toxic ash, but the ash still blows into the community. Next slide. The other thing that the county will tell us is that, oh, well, but wait a minute, this is a waste to energy incinerator. So this was an idea brokered, I think, back in the 40s and 50s, that, oh, well, if we burn everything, we can capture the gases, we can capture the heat, we can heat homes. And we actually do. In Dutchess County, about 10,000 homes are heated with energy that is sold to Central Hudson, which represents approximately, not quite, 8% of the county's housing stock. It's not clean, it's not renewable energy, it shouldn't be considered renewable energy, and it's, I will editorialize and say that it is completely ridiculous at a time when there are grants available from NYSERDA and from the EPA that would fund renewable energy options to heat these homes. Next slide. So Dutchess County makes a new plan every 10 years. The last new plan was rolled out in December of 2023, and it suggests that we continue to incinerate our trash into the 2030s and beyond. And just a note that the financing bonds and the contract with the Win Waste, which manages the incinerator, runs the incinerator, these expire in 2027. So this is a really excellent time to address this, because we can make, the county can absolutely make different decisions moving forward. Next slide. So Delaware County, Pennsylvania is an example of a county that is moving forward. Delaware County is home to the largest incinerator in the country, and Delaware County is that portion of Pennsylvania below Philadelphia to the Delaware border. They studied 3 scenarios, right? They had a very robust program of studying and creating a plan of sustainability. So their first scenario was to burn trash, to send ash and non-recycled waste to landfill, which is what we're already doing. Scenario 2, send everything to the landfill without burning it. And scenario 3, adopt a zero waste plan that ends incineration, eventually reduces by 90% what goes to landfill, and then what goes to landfill is stabilized biologically so that it doesn't outgas methane and other toxic compounds. So, not surprisingly, we can head to the next slide. Not surprisingly, the study found that landfilling was actually better for the climate. And again, we are not proposing landfilling, but that incineration was 69% worse than landfilling for the climate, and 134% worse, more than twice as bad when other health and environmental impacts were included. And other impacts include things like time lost from work, sick days, kids not being able to go to school, the cost of healthcare, doctor visits, medical treatments. The analysis, based in science, is outlined in the Delaware County report. And Delaware County has adopted a zero waste program and is moving forward to reduce their waste, to move away from incineration. And so in some ways, they kind of lead the way. And again, we will share this presentation, and their report, their analysis, is linked in the PDF. Next slide. So we're here because we believe that we can commit to cleaner air in Dutchess County and be part of the solution. Next slide. Zero waste may sound a little pie in the sky, but it is both practical and aspirational. It is a long-term strategy based on concepts of recovery and elimination. So it requires municipalities to create systems supporting zero waste goals, which would include a plan to close the incinerator. It does require producers to take responsibility for sustainable design and production and recovery. It inspires collective action from individual people and households, and the result is a sustainable environment for our children and our grandchildren. Next slide. The 5 R's of zero waste: refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, and rot. And rot, of course, is composting. Next slide. There's a few municipalities who have already adopted zero waste policies. These are only a few listed. Over 550 municipalities around the world are already taking steps to transition. This is an international movement to change how we deal with our waste. Next slide. Zero waste policies can boost the local economy, and for all of its vast capability to burn, my understanding is that the facility, this process, really only employs about 40 people. Next slide. A zero waste sustainable plan becomes a job creator. So the top line there, building deconstruction, has to do with repurposing and reusing what can be reused. We've seen the recovery of brick, right? But there's many more construction items that can be recovered. Recycling and composting, reuse, repair, thrift sales. Just a side note that in Beacon, I think it was June 5th, there was a repair cafe. There were 17 folks who knew how to repair things. 66 community members came with 140 items, and over, I think, close to 60% of the items brought were repaired. So imagine that on a grand scale. To build out a center for hard to recycle materials, right? Those things that we end up putting in the trash because there's no place else to put it. And it's, so potential jobs. Next slide. This is a quote from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. And here in Dutchess County, we have some fantastic examples of that, right? I would give a shout out to Scenic Hudson, whose genesis was in the resistance to removing the mountaintop of Storm King Mountain in order to build a utilities facility. And it started with a group of people in Fanny Reese, was it Fanny Reese? In her kitchen. And they were successful. It was a multi-year campaign. They were successful, and out of that, Scenic Hudson was born. The other example I can think of here in Dutchess County is Pete Seeger and the building of the Clearwater, and the role that boat and that campaign and those educational efforts had in cleaning up the Hudson River. Next slide. So the petition has already been put in the chat. The petition goes to the Honorable Sue Serino, all of the Dutchess County legislators. And it will prompt you also to send an email to SAME, highlighting your individual representative, if you are so inclined. And we are asking that they recognize that there's no amount of pollution that is safe, that it's time we must plan now and act with urgency to transition away from incineration. Specifically in the 2025 budget, to budget for a zero waste management consultant, somebody who is certified and knowledgeable to guide the county to a future without incineration and to design and to implement zero waste strategies. Next slide. So we don't have postcards in the room because we're here virtually, but we do have the petition. We are also going to put a link to a volunteer interest form for Mothers Out Front Dutchess, for those of you who might feel called to help with this campaign. And now we can go to the next slide. I know that there are questions in the chat. There are a couple of additional slides, 3 pages of resources, which again you will get when we email you the PDF of this PowerPoint. I am going to mute myself to turn this over to my colleague Johanna Fowlett. And I think, Bella, we can stop sharing screen.
Oh, Johanna, you unmute yourself.
My apologies. Sandy, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. We are fortunate to have Dr. Neil Seldman here to join Sandy and me in answering your questions. Dr. Seldman's long career has been devoted to providing technical assistance to cities, community groups, and businesses throughout the country in the field of sustainable resource management. The list of his accomplishments is really too long to mention here. Among other things, he co-founded the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and directed its Waste to Wealth initiative. He has authored several important works and has documented worldwide recycling developments for the World Bank, the global partnership of 5 institutions that provide financial and technical support to developing countries. Dr. Seldman writes regularly for trade journals to provide insight and criticism of poorly designed technologies and programs. We are so grateful to him for his guidance. So let's take the first question.
Okay, great. So the first question is, it says, your presentation is so compelling. How did the waste management plan propose continuing their incinerator? Who supports it and why? Just status quo?
Well, they believe that the county landfills are closed and that landfilling is at the bottom of the list proposed by EPA's hierarchy of waste management. I think that they're not, and perhaps there's a monetary issue involved because of the sale of energy to Central Hudson. So we have to look into that further. Neil, do you want to add or correct anything that I've said?
Yes, a couple of things. You're quite correct that the US EPA bears some responsibility for this because they have been claiming for years that incineration is better than landfill. Just this year, they were forced to put a disclaimer on their webpage saying that there's absolutely no data to support that conclusion. Also, the EPA is backing off a lot of their materials that support incineration. In answer to the question as to why in your county, in Dutchess County, you have an incinerator, it goes back a long way. Obviously, this was built years ago when waste energy was a fad, but now it has institutional fans. It has people who are running incinerators, elected officials who've voted for incinerators, and they have a vested interest, both professionally and monetarily, to keep that going. There are a number of other issues involved, but the main thing is that there are citizens across the country There are 9 active fights against incinerators, mainly because people are reading the science and understanding that city officials and environmental officials and people running solid waste management programs have been wrong. And a lot of people, it's very hard for them to admit that they're wrong, but the science just shows that they're wrong. The economics shows that they're wrong. I believe Sandy or Joanna mentioned that burning garbage is the most expensive and most polluting way to deal with your garbage. And let me end this response by pointing out that 2 years ago there was a study in the city of Baltimore, which has an incinerator, and the group found the group of scientists found that the cost of just particulate matter, which is just one form of pollution coming from the incinerator, costs the city $55 million a year. And that calculation is based on the number of lives in the city that are cut short by the pollution coming from the incinerator. And for lives that are ended before their natural life, there's a direct economic cost. And that's only one instance. I believe Sandy mentioned emergency visits to children's hospitals. We've been researching this for years, and we've interviewed emergency room doctors. And one very prominent doctor in the Minneapolis area, she pointed out to us that sometimes 90% of her shift is just dealing with children with emergency asthma attacks. And as was mentioned in the presentation, there are many triggers to asthma, and the incinerator is a major cause of those triggers.
Thank
Caroline,
you. Thank you. I'll go to the next question. But first, there was someone who asked about the link to the Delaware County report with their findings. And Mike Ewall from Energy Justice Network and Sandy had put some links.
Good.
And I think Sandy gave us the link to the Delaware County report. So that's in the chat. And we'll also send that out to everyone in a follow-up email.
Caroline, may I just add that there are other studies which I believe Sandy and Joanna have, but they're transition studies. In other words, in Montgomery County, Maryland, where citizens and the county executive are trying to shut the plant, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, we have prepared plans showing step by step how the county, in both Hennepin County and Minneapolis, Montgomery County in Maryland, step by step, month by month, what has to be done to shut the incinerators and transition to a zero waste system, which in the long run will lower the amount of garbage going to landfill less than the current amount of ash going to landfill from your incinerator.
Fabulous. So that we don't have to reinvent the wheel for these solutions.
Yes.
So the next question is, has the approach to Dutchess County legislators requested that they evaluate more clean means of disposing trash? And then if so, what was their response?
Oh my goodness. Since February, I personally have gone to the Dutchess County Legislature to offer a 3-minute comment with various factors about the Dutchess County incinerator. And I know that some legislators have proposed legislation of support for example, the Plastic Recycling and Infrastructure Act. I may not have the title, exact, but which would make manufacturers responsible for recreating their packaging so that it's less plastic and more compostable, along with other things. And the county legislature did not want to issue a resolution of support. I think that there's some resistance along party lines, but hopefully with continued urging by the citizens for clean air and a new look, a fresh look at the way we do things, to look beyond the status quo. We hope that the legislators will move forward. There was a small attempt last year to put in a minor budget for a certified zero waste management consultant, but it was too late in the process, and the details of who the consultant would report to and so on, have to be worked out. So maybe there's a chance this year that they will move forward the way Westchester County has, to put out a $90,000 RFP, request for proposal, for a zero waste management consultant.
I'd like to jump in here
Yes,
just
Sandy.
briefly and say, yes, we were late to the game last fall, and the plan, the new 10-year plan, was well underway, and didn't really get any traction. But I also really want to give a shout out here to our colleague Mike Ewald. He is a scientist and an expert. He's posting in the chat some responses. We certainly can call on Mike to answer questions as well. And he is, I believe, one of the founders of the Energy Justice Network. So I didn't want to move forward without acknowledging that Mike was in the room.
Good.
Thank you, Mike. Do you have anything that you want to add to this last question?
Well, first, let me point out I'm not technically a scientist, although I'm often confused as being one. Technically I'm a lawyer, though, and I'm the founder and executive director of Energy Justice Network. I was about to answer another question, so I was distracted with what I was typing. But sorry, what was the question you were just asking me about?
Well, it's all right.
About the consultant. Was that about hiring the consultant? On that.
Well, that's a petition. People should sign that petition so we can hire a consultant, so the legislature will. We can move on to the next. If you want.
Yes, let's move on to the next question.
Caroline, let me just say that the technical reports that I referred to a few minutes ago, Mike was a co-investigator for those reports. I just wanted to bring that up to date.
Great, yes. So the next question is, you discussed the health risks. How does the county find workers willing to work at this resource recovery site place where we're going to be doing all this, sort of sorting and stuff? And what are their health risks? Isn't that a long-term risk for the county? Finding workers who are going to be working in this area.
Well, I think that air pollution is an invisible threat, and most people are not educated about what's coming out of that incinerator. And people need jobs, and they take them. But Neil or Sandy, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, if you're referring to people who work in the plant, the 35 or 40 people in the plant, they of course are exposed to many environmental dangers. If you're referring to the people who will take jobs when alternatives are put in deconstruction, recycling, composting, those jobs are not dealing with hazardous materials. Those jobs are dealing with materials that have been set aside for recycling, like a bale of paper, a ton of metal, etc. Building materials that are going to be taken down and reused. So those workers are not subject to hazardous conditions.
Okay. The next question is, does the contract the county holds with the incinerator operator obligate the county to deliver a certain amount of waste to that facility?
Yes, in fact,
that's one I'm sorry, that's why I just answered it in the chat. If you want to scroll down a little bit more, you'll see the provision from the contract that does have the put or pay clause.
Right. In other words, if the county doesn't submit enough waste to the incinerator, we have to pay a fee. But that fee has not been paid over many years. I forget when it stopped occurring, because we always provide enough trash to be burned.
But that's an important point, because that's why recycling, composting, and reuse are a threat to the incinerator, because those programs were implemented in the county. You would not have 450 tons a day to deliver to that facility. So there's a built-in prejudice against these alternatives by the people who are running and supporting the incinerator.
It's also worth pointing out that incineration competes with recycling and composting, partially because of these put or pay clauses. In Claremont, New Hampshire, this is going back to the 90s, but it's the most spectacular example of a bankruptcy related to a put or pay clause specifically. 29 towns filed for bankruptcy because of a put or pay clause in a Wheelbrader incinerator contract. and the court didn't let them go bankrupt and made them pay up. So you have things like that, and more recent examples like from Florida, where because they want to feed their incinerator, they've actually cracked down and prevented composting projects from being operational, just so they can promise that waste to the incinerator.
So there are no other questions unless there are other people who want to put their question in the chat now or want to raise their hand and just simply ask the question that they have. Let's see.
Hannah Karp.
Wasn't sure how to write this out. So you talked about many different reasons and ways that are causing this facility to pollute. One of them, you talked about the EPA limitations not applying. You talked about the contract, requiring us to deliver trash so that Central Hudson, you could fulfill that contract, et cetera, et cetera. What do you feel are the main next steps or multiple steps that we be supporting? Because it seems like, again, it's such a multi-factor issue and there are many angles we can work. I don't know what you see as most doable, again, from a micro to macro level. Sorry, that was a lot of questions at once.
It's all right. I think I'm sure Neil and Mike would want to add to this, but in our opinion, as lay people, we want the county to recognize that no amount of pollution is safe, and that we have to act with urgency because we have a climate crisis and we're putting CO2 into the air. We've been doing it since 1989, and that CO2 lasts for hundreds of years in the atmosphere. So the next reasonable step would be to ask him to examine the alternatives, hire a certified zero waste management consultant so that we could do a roadmap for the county suited to our specific needs and ramp up what we do well and install systems and policies and practices that aren't there now. So Neil, do you want to add to that?
Just that the roadmaps already exist. As I mentioned, Mike and I and others have put together very technical, as I said, month by month plans on how to legally end the contracts with the incinerator companies and how to simultaneously implement alternatives, which we know are reuse, composting, and recycling. One of the most effective things that the county can do is to get behind a county-wide composting system, which doesn't necessarily mean one big plant. It means working with each individual town to develop what we call a distributed composting system. That is, encourage and incentivize backyard composting, which is terrific for educating your kids. Community-based systems, we call them compost gardens, where you compost your materials and the finished compost supports a community garden for children, for adults, etc. And finally, the county may need one or two centralized, not gigantic, but a couple of hundred tons per day for centralized processing. And by doing this, you're eliminating, as the chart that was shown earlier, about 30 to 40% of the waste stream is turned into topsoil. There are markets for finished compost year-round in your region, and the finished compost, if it's good, sells for about $75 a ton. That's roughly $25 a cubic yard. And that's where the jobs come from, because as you compost, you add value. And when you add value, you can afford to pay a worker to process the compost, bag it, sell it, and you create a network of small businesses, which is exactly what we want for an expanded tax base in your county.
I would like to jump in and answer that question from the point of view of the layperson. What can we do? We can talk to our legislative representative, right? Who on the Dutchess County Legislature represents you and your community? We can, and obviously we're trying to do that to bring pressure to bear on the legislature. We can try to speak with our county executive, Sue Serino, which we are going to do. You know, we can all go up on that second, it's typically the second Monday of the month in Poughkeepsie. I think it's 39 Market Street, up on the 6th floor. And the gentleman who sits in the lobby is very welcoming and will direct you to the elevators, and you can make your 3-minute comment. You know, we are the constituents. They need to listen to us. And I truly believe that, you know, while this may take some time, that over time we can move the needle, and that while we make the environmental argument and we make the human health argument, we must make the fiduciary argument as well, because it is the fiduciary. Our legislators have a fiduciary responsibility, and many of them tend to respond to that call before they respond to environment.
And you can start by signing the petition. That's what the petition is all about.
Right, and Mike has his hand raised, so go ahead, Mike.
Sure. Excuse me. So there are multiple levels of government at which you can win a battle like this. And I just want to provide a quick little roadmap on some of it. First of all, you don't shut an incinerator down usually by doing zero waste solutions. These are separate tracks. You need to do the composting like Neil's talked about. You need to do the recycling. You need to do the reduce and reuse before that. Ban plastic bags, ban all the other things that are single use, etc. All those things are part of zero waste solutions, but they're not enough to close an incinerator, especially when you have a contract that says you have to feed it a certain amount of trash or get penalized financially. So the incinerator stands in the way of doing those things in the first place. So I think you should have a team of people that works on those solution sides, but you need a just as dedicated team of core people focused on directly how we end incineration. And part of that could be a zero waste plan, but only if you hire the right people and ask the right questions. And in Delaware County, we had the right people willing to let me alter their request for proposals and get the right language in there, which got the right questions and the right people involved. If you're missing one of those, you miss the boat. And so as we're seeing right now in Westchester County, they watered down our language, and they're probably, I fear, about to hire the wrong people and ask them the wrong question. So they can end up talking about, we're going to reduce waste, not do zero waste. We're going to reduce waste and leave out any talk about ending incineration, which is where they're moving toward. So if you're not very precise and laser focused and making sure the right people are hiring the right people, then you can really miss the boat on that one. So that's the county level. And it could also be done by local government level. So if the county level is hopeless and you haven't kicked enough of the bastards out and put in good people in order to get the right things done, because that is probably going to be necessary over time, to be real about it, then you could get a set of municipalities to team up and put some in to a pot for a budget to hire the right people and ask the right questions. And that study can still be a study that is for the whole county, but at least you make sure you have control over hiring the right people and asking the right things. Now, at the local level, the town of Poughkeepsie could do things on their own that could get this incinerator shut down even quicker than a lot of other options. I'm not going to go into detail on that right now, right here. But if you get a core of people who are actually town residents in Poughkeepsie and organize them strongly enough, I can guide you through the process of what laws you would want to hand to your local government to get it nailed at that level. That's probably the most effective level because it's where the people power is the strongest at the most local level. The larger levels you go, the harder it is to make change, which is why you can do things at the state level, but it's a lot more difficult. You're dealing with 10 incinerators you have to lobby against. And at the federal level, there are efforts going on there as well, and I'm involved in some of them, but it gets even harder at that level.
Let me make some of the comments that Mike just said very graphic. We have done zero waste transition reports in Baltimore, Montgomery County, Minneapolis. And every time we get started, we work for the citizen groups. The county involved comes up with their own zero waste plan, which in part sounds very much like ours, but then they conclude that they're going to need the incinerator for another 20 years. And they call that zero waste. So these are the ins and outs of the roadmap that citizens need to be well aware of. And quite frankly, that's the job of Mike and I and our colleagues. We are working with you to keep you informed and bring you up on the latest strategies as well as the latest technical information.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just there's two more questions if we can just get them in real quick. The first one is, have you seen the county climate action plan, which is now out for comment? Can we use this as a vehicle to get the comments out? Oh, Sandy.
The county climate action plan is important. Comments can be made. Incinerator emissions are not included in this report. They're waiting for a separate report, and it has to do with the fact that the incinerator is operated by like an authority. So I haven't super carefully read the plan. I intend to do so, and I intend to try to add A and B so I can make a comment that is informed both by other sources of emissions as well as the incinerator.
Let me add a little bit to back that up, Sandy. In our experience in Baltimore, even though, just like in your county, where the trash incinerator is the largest single source of greenhouse gases or pollution in general, same is true in Baltimore. But in their climate action plan, they basically erased the incinerator's emissions from their inventory because they use a model from ICLEI, which is this international, I forget what the whole acronym stands for, something about Consortium for Local Environmental Initiatives, something like that. But they have a model that says that if they sell electricity, then you count it in the electricity sector. So they get to dilute the incinerator's emissions across multiple states. So it ends up being almost nothing, even though the incinerator is propped up by the city, sending in most of its waste and buying a lot of the heat and steam from it. And so it should count most of that emissions, and they don't. That's just one of the ways they game these systems so they can make incinerator emissions look like they're not there.
Let me add at this point very briefly. It costs money to build infrastructure for zero waste programs. And at this particular time in history, the next couple of years, your county can get the money to plan and build the necessary infrastructure from the federal government. There are literally billions of dollars that are available through a whole variety of agencies. The climate action plan is one of the best ways. If you can get zero waste infrastructure into your climate action plan, it is fundable by these grants. And we Zero Waste USA can provide you and your government agency people the list of about 15 or 20 different grant programs that would cover zero waste infrastructure.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. That's amazing. You guys are amazing resources for us. There's a final question here. Are there any counties currently composting?
Oh, across the country, there are excellent composting programs all over California. Cleveland, Ohio, has an incredible composting network. It started as a composting group in one neighborhood, and the name of the group is Rust Belt Riders. And in 5 years, they have now expanded. They have 35 workers, 5 trucks covering every community in the city. Citizens in Detroit are replicating that program. They have their own plan. Detroit is a city that has tremendous open spaces so that you literally can collect the organic material and compost it in your own neighborhood and get the benefit of using the finished compost, as well as the benefit of hiring young people to do the work. So there are many, many examples. In fact, July 9th, I'll send Mothers Out Front the announcement. We're having a webinar on the state of the art of recycling with 2 of the top compost experts in the country, Nora Goldstein from BioCycle and Craig Coker from Coker Composting. And we will be talking about how to scale up, how to start, how to get financed. There are many, many good models for composting at the county level. at the neighborhood level and at the city level.
Great. Thank you so much for answering that question, Neil, Mike, Nate, Johanna, and Sandy. Thank you for being the Q&A panel. And so Johanna's just going to wrap everything up and give us some summarizing statements, things like that.
Right. So once again, thanks all of you for your listening and for your time and for your questions. The Dutchess County Incinerator is an important consideration for all county residents. The decisions about the incinerator are being made now. We need our planning officials to recognize the hazards associated with the county incinerator and to act with urgency, to do the research and adopt sustainable alternatives to burning trash. We need our legislators to budget for a certified zero waste management consultant. But as Mike said, zero waste management alone doesn't close down the incinerator. There are other factors to take into account for that. It's just one step in the right direction to reduce trash. Mike or Neil, do you want to add anything as a summarizing statement?
Sure, I'll say something. The question that I pointed out before, and Mike alluded to, that there's always a counter zero waste plan that includes an incinerator, which is of course ridiculous. If you're supporting an incinerator, you say to people like yourselves, well, when we get to zero waste, we'll shut the incinerator. In fact, the incinerator is the major impediment to getting to zero waste, because all the time of the government agencies, your county staff people, all of they're doing is working to support that incinerator. They'll never get to zero waste. So the beginning the shutdown and simultaneously planning for zero waste, they have to be done together. And that's what's happening, as I pointed out, in 9 communities across the country, where citizens have organized, put together plans, and are actively working to shut down these incinerators and start the road to zero waste in their particular communities.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's time to say goodbye. You can unmute and wave to everyone. Thank you so much. Don't forget